Just after sunrise, when the streets of Kumsilga were still quiet and the dust had not yet risen from the morning traffic, an old forgotten building stood in the pale light like a relic of a life that never fully lived. For nearly 17 years, people passed it without turning their heads, high cracked walls, windows shattered by time, and a rusty gate that had not opened for so long it felt almost fused into place. Mothers walking their children to school knew it. Taxi drivers ignored it. Farmers heading to the market barely glanced at it. It was simply there, like a memory people preferred not to revisit. For the older generation, it symbolized disappointment, a national dream that collapsed without warning, leaving behind silence, dust, and a cautionary tale no one wanted to repeat. And yet, in early 2025, something unusual disturbed that silence. A few residents, those who woke before dawn, noticed a convoy of unmarked trucks rolling toward the abandoned brewery. No noise, no ceremony, no explanation. The next day, more trucks came, then engineers, then security, and suddenly the building that had slept for nearly 2 decades was breathing again. But no official announcement followed, no ministerial visit, no press briefing. The work happening behind those walls felt intentional, but mysterious. People began whispering in the markets, in buses, in evening gatherings. Who bought the place? Are they tearing it down? Is something finally changing? Nobody had answers. And then came November 25th, 2025, the day that turned whispers into shock and silence into celebration. But before we step into that moment, let me ask you this. How often in your lifetime have you seen a nation take a symbol of failure and rebuild it into a monument of hope? And what does it take for any people to believe in their own strength again? If you care about stories that reveal the quiet strength of nations rising on their own terms, stay with us. And if you want to support content that digs deeper than the headlines, feel free to subscribe and share this journey with others who believe truth deserves to be told. For years, the abandoned brewery in Kumsilga sat like a husk drained of its purpose. The people who lived nearby often described it the same way you would describe an old battlefield: quiet, unsettling, and strangely heavy. Every morning, residents walked past its dust-stained walls on their way to work, to school, to the market. And every day, the building stared back with its broken windows, reflecting nothing but the bright Sahel sun. It was a place time had stopped touching, a place whose story ended long before the country was ready to let it go. But everything changed in early 2025, and it began with the simplest of signs: a low rumble just before dawn. Not the rumble of traffic, not the sound of a passing convoy. This was different. Older residents, the ones who always woke first, noticed trucks they couldn't identify moving slowly toward the gates of the dead factory. The vehicles carried no logos, no flags, nothing to hint at who sent them or what their purpose was. The next morning, the same thing happened. Then, the morning after that. At first, the neighborhood ignored it. After all, over the years, there had been rumors, false promises from politicians, businessmen, and dreamers who claimed they would revive the plant. None ever did. But by the end of that week, people knew something was different. Workers were now entering the compound with equipment no one recognized. Engineers followed soon after, and then came a security team that set up a perimeter, keeping the curious at a distance. The silence surrounding the activity only deepened the mystery. No ministerial convoy, no government spokespeople, no official declaration. It was as if whatever was happening inside those walls was meant to stay hidden until the very last moment. Still, the signs could not be ignored. New steel beams appeared. Cranes loomed over the skeletal remains of the old factory. Piles of broken machinery were hauled away. The hollow interior started filling with sound, again hammering, welding, drilling, a slow reawakening after nearly 2 decades of sleep. By mid-year, people in Ouagadougou were talking. Some believed the site had been sold to a foreign company. Others thought it was being demolished to make way for a new housing estate. A few hopeful voices whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, the brewery was coming back to life. But no one really believed it. The wound from its collapse in 2008 still ran deep, and the silence from officials did nothing to ease those memories. Then came the morning of November 25th, 2025, a date that would become etched into the industrial history of Burkina Faso. Before sunrise, banners were raised around the entrance, bright, clean, unmistakably new. Loudspeakers were installed. Workers emerged wearing crisp uniforms no one had ever seen before. By 8 a.m., a crowd formed outside the gates. People who had ignored the factory for years now stood shoulder to shoulder trying to understand what they were witnessing. The air felt charged like the moment before a storm breaks. And then a presidential motorcade arrived. When President Ibrahim Traoré stepped out, the mood shifted from curiosity to electricity. Cameras flashed, families pushed closer. Some older workers' men who had once drawn a salary from the very factory behind those walls could be seen wiping their eyes. The announcement was direct, powerful, and historic. SN Brafaso had been fully revived after 17 years of abandonment. A collapsed national brewery, once considered beyond saving, had been rebuilt for 17 billion CFA francs, modernized with state-of-the-art systems, and redesigned to operate entirely on local maize, sorghum, and rice. The trucks made sense now. The secrecy made sense now. The silent reconstruction was not a demolition. It was a resurrection. For many Burkinabe, this was not just news, it was vindication. A symbol of national pride resurrected not with foreign ownership or outside money, but through a deliberate plan grounded in sovereignty and self-reliance. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the brewery's gates were open not to close, but to begin again. Long before the celebration of November 25, 2025, there was a different kind of story inside those same walls, one marked not by triumph, but by disappointment. To understand the power of the comeback, the country had to face the memory of its fall. Back in 2004, when the original Brafaso brewery first opened, the whole nation held its breath with pride. Ordinary families remember that moment well. Radio hosts praised it as a new era, workers lined up eagerly for training, and young men in Ouagadougou dreamed of stable factory jobs for the first time in their lives. For a while, the machines hummed with confidence. Bottles rolled off the line like a promise Burkina Faso could build something its people would call their own. But behind the walls, invisible to the public, fractures were forming. Management stumbled. Purchases were made without planning or accountability. Supplies were inconsistent. Budgets vanished faster than production could cover. Workers noticed the tension first: late salaries, unexplained shortages, broken machines that stayed broken longer each month. They whispered their worries to each other during lunch breaks, but no one dared imagine how deep the collapse really was. By 2008, the fall was sudden, brutal, and silent. No announcement, no warning. One morning, workers arrived to find the gates locked and their futures rewritten. Those who lived through it still remember the shock. Older men who had given their best years to the brewery walked home that day carrying their lunchboxes, unsure what they would tell their families. Younger workers, many supporting entire households, felt the ground pulled out from under them. And the building, once a national achievement, became a monument to embarrassment. For years, people refused to speak its name. Even when the government purchased the property in 2012, hope never returned. Politics shifted. Administrations changed. Promises rose and fell like the seasons. The factory remained untouched, its metal skeleton rusting deeper with each passing year. The silence was heavy. Some believed the place was cursed. Others said its failure proved that national industry simply wasn't meant to survive here. This is why the events of early 2025 felt almost surreal. Residents had trained themselves to expect nothing. So when they saw cranes lifting new steel towers, when they heard welding echoing out of the yard, when they watched security personnel close off the gates, they didn't dare hope. Not yet, but they talked. They wondered. Their curiosity became the first stirrings of a collective heartbeat, long thought dead. And then came the climax, the morning when the truth finally revealed itself. As President Ibrahim Traoré stepped up to speak on November 25th, the weight of 17 years hung in the air. Some former workers in the crowd gripped each other's shoulders. Mothers who once feared for their children's futures listened with the concentration of people hearing history being rewritten. When Traoré announced the full rehabilitation of SN Brafaso, the reaction was immediate and emotional. Some people cheered with relief. Some cried quietly. Some simply stood still, as if trying to reconcile the sight before them with the painful memories of 2008. Radio stations across the country broke into special coverage. Social media exploded with images of the revived brewery, shiny metal tanks, new production lines, rows of young workers being trained. Markets buzzed. Local shops discussed how supply chains might change. Farmers in the countryside, especially those growing maize, sorghum, and rice, celebrated the possibility of stable income for the first time in years. But beyond excitement, there was something deeper, a shift in national psychology. The resurrection of Brafaso symbolized something citizens had long doubted, that a failed project could be redeemed, that national industry could rise without foreign ownership, that mistakes of the past did not need to define the future. For a country that had watched factories collapse and dreams be postponed, this moment felt like reclaiming a piece of dignity long stolen by time. The comeback was no longer just about beer. It was about belief. In the weeks that followed, the grand reopening, life in the neighborhoods surrounding Comsilga began to change in ways no one had predicted. At dawn, instead of the eerie quiet that had defined the area for nearly 2 decades, the sound of footsteps and bicycles filled the road as young workers made their way to the new SN Brafaso training center. Market women who once sold only vegetables now added bottles of locally produced drinks to their tables. And in the late afternoon, small groups of former employees, men who had worked at the old factory before its collapse, gathered outside the gates, quietly watching the new generation step into jobs they had long believed would never return. These were not dramatic scenes, they were subtle, everyday moments. But together they represented something far deeper, the awakening of public confidence. For years, Burkina Faso's citizens had grown used to disappointments, used to hearing that large industries always belonged to foreign corporations, used to believing that revival was something that happened in other nations, but not theirs. The rebirth of SN Brafaso began to crack that mindset. One of the most profound civil effects came from the countryside. Farmers from remote villages, women harvesting sorghum, men tending maize fields began receiving notices from buyers representing the brewery. For the first time, their crops were tied to a national industry rather than informal markets. It meant stability, predictability, and dignity. Many said this was the first time they felt connected to the country's industrial future. A farmer from the outskirts of Tenkodogo put it simply on a radio interview. "When my harvest enters that factory, I feel like my work matters." Urban workers felt the shift too. The creation of 200 permanent jobs and an ecosystem of 20,000 indirect opportunities didn't just boost employment, it reshaped the relationship between the government and the people. After years of political turbulence, many citizens began viewing national projects with renewed optimism. They saw tangible proof that the state could deliver results, not just promises. Politically, the reopening of Brafaso had an even deeper impact. It became a symbol of a new governing doctrine centered on sovereignty and self-reliance. Rather than announcing grand reforms or delivering long speeches, the government chose a different path: quiet, disciplined work behind closed doors until the results could speak for themselves. This approach resonated strongly with a population fatigued by decades of rhetoric without action. For the administration, SN Brafaso became a case study of what national economic independence could look like in practice. It demonstrated that the country was capable of rescuing, rebuilding, and operating major industries without depending on foreign ownership or imported raw materials. The message was unmistakable. Thus, Burkina Faso was stepping into a new phase of industrial awakening guided by strategy rather than circumstance. Civil society organizations, long critical of abandoned state projects, acknowledged the transformation. Some described SN Brafaso as the first reversal of national decline, while others saw it as the beginning of a new industrial morality, a belief that failures could be corrected rather than forgotten. But perhaps the most significant political impact was psychological. As the factory's new production lines began humming, citizens started asking deeper questions. If this could be revived, why not our textile plants? Why not our food processing factories? Why not every forgotten project lying in silence across the country? In that sense, SN Brafaso did more than reopen. It reactivated a national imagination, one that had been dormant since the factory gates first closed in 2008. When news of SN Brafaso's revival began circulating beyond Burkina Faso's borders, the international response was far more attentive than anyone expected. At first glance, the reopening of a single brewery might seem insignificant on the global stage, but to observers who have studied Africa's long struggle for industrial independence, the event carried symbolic weight far beyond beer production. It represented something larger, something nations around the world, especially major powers, could no longer ignore: a shift toward economic self-determination. Across Africa, analysts began to describe the project as a proof of concept. If a factory considered dead for 17 years could be rebuilt entirely through local will and domestic supply chains, then what other dormant industries across the continent might be? Next, textile plants, food processing centers, mining refiners. The pattern was unmistakable. African nations were no longer content with exporting raw materials and importing finished goods. They wanted full value creation at home. But the most interesting reactions came from the United States, particularly among older generations who understood industrial cycles on a personal level. For Americans over 60, the story of SN Brafaso felt strangely familiar. They had lived through the rise and fall of U.S. manufacturing steel mills, closing in Pennsylvania auto plants, shuttering in Michigan, entire towns reshaped by offshoring. Many remembered the shock of watching once thriving industries collapse, followed years later by attempts at revival. To them, the resurrection of a forgotten African factory didn't feel foreign at all. It felt like déjà vu. Commentators on American talk shows drew parallels to the revitalization of Rust Belt towns, where communities fought to bring back production not just for economic reasons, but for dignity. They recognized the emotional power of a factory reopening. They understood what it meant for workers who once lost everything to be given a second chance. And many admired that Burkina Faso pursued this revival, using local crops maize, sorghum, rice, putting farmers at the heart of the production chain. On the geopolitical level, think tanks in Washington and Europe had a different reaction, one marked by curiosity, even caution. For decades, global beverage markets in West Africa had been dominated by multinational corporations with deep pockets and well-established networks. A nationally revived competitor with state backing and local supply advantages had the potential to disrupt that landscape. Reports quietly circulated in policy circles describing SN Brafaso as part of a broader trend in Africa, nations pushing back against foreign dependency and reclaiming ownership of key industries. Some analysts called it industrial sovereignty, others referred to it as economic realignment, but nearly all agreed on one point: this was not a one-off story. This was momentum. From a worldwide perspective, SN Brafaso's revival signaled that the economic future of Africa might no longer be defined solely by outside investors, but by homegrown ambition. And that shift, if it continues, could reshape everything from trade flows to regional alliances. For American viewers, especially those who value fairness, hard work, and national pride, the message resonated clearly. A country that rebuilds what was broken and does so with its own hands earns a different kind of respect. It becomes a story worth watching. And in this moment, as Africa news outlets highlighted the resurgence of local industries, one question emerged across international discussions. If Burkina Faso can revive a factory left for dead since 2008, what might the rest of the continent be capable of in the years ahead? As the sun sets over Komsilga today, the revived SN Brafaso stands not just as a factory, but as a reminder of how quickly a nation's story can change when its people choose to believe in themselves again. The gates that once rusted in silence now open every morning to the footsteps of workers who carry both pride and responsibility. Many of them were children when the factory collapsed in 2008. Some weren't even born yet. And yet in their hands, a forgotten dream has found new life. But with every rebirth comes a warning, one that history has whispered across generations and across continents. No revival, no matter how impressive, can survive without vigilance. SN Brafaso's story is powerful precisely because it had already died once. It serves as a lesson that mismanagement, dependency, and short-term thinking can undo even the most hopeful national projects. The challenge now is not only to celebrate the comeback, but to protect it, to ensure that the mistakes of 2008 stay buried in the past, while the lessons remain very much alive. This moment also invites a broader reflection. If a factory abandoned for nearly 2 decades can rise again, what else is possible? How many forgotten plants across Burkina Faso, textile mills, food processors, mechanical workshops might be waiting for their own second chance? And what would it mean for millions of African families if entire industries were reclaimed, rebuilt, and placed back into national hands? These are not just economic questions, they are human ones, because every factory that reopens is more than a building. It is a promise. It is a signal to young people that their future does not have to be written overseas. It is a message to farmers that their labor is valuable. It is a reminder to older generations that decline is not destiny. But perhaps the most important question is the one we must ask ourselves. Do we truly believe this kind of transformation can continue, or will this revival fade into history as just another isolated success? For our viewers in the United States, especially those who have lived through factory closings, economic downturns, and the struggle to rebuild, you understand better than most what is at stake. You know the pain of loss and the pride of recovery. And you recognize the courage it takes for a nation to rewrite its own story. So let me ask you directly, do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective yet? And can Burkina Faso sustain this momentum? Or should another leader one day take up the mission? If you feel you are among the first to support this new chapter for Burkina Faso, please share this video. And if you believe that truth is more important than the headlines, subscribe and stay with us as we continue following the stories shaping Africa's future, stories that rarely make it to mainstream media but deserve to be told. Because in the end, this is more than Africa news. It is a glimpse of what nations can achieve when they decide that failure is not the end of the story.